etc. Now, it's really important to note that this idea of zero waste, this is an ideal, this is a goal, this is something that we're striving towards. It's not something that each individual person can necessarily really do, because no matter what our actions are, as long as those violent systems, those extractive, wasteful systems are still intact, we're still necessarily going to be dealing with it. So just because one individual person is zero waste, you know, that still means that there's work to be done. I like to kind of compare this to conversations about anti-racism. There's no 100% anti-racist person because the violent racist systems are still intact. So it's something we have to work towards constantly, every moment, constantly changing our behaviors, reflecting, and doing all that we can to combat the violent systems as much as we can in our own personal lives, especially as we wait for the systems and structures to change. Next slide, please. All right, and now of course, we're all going to have different relationships to waste and waste infrastructure based on numerous factors, but one main one is our proximity to waste and waste infrastructure. The ways we think about waste can differ depending on that. So for instance, one of the things that sparked my interest in even learning more about discard studies and waste inequity was every community I've ever lived in since I was a child. I lived right next to a landfill, or I lived in a heavily polluted community. And it was the constant bombardment of all of these things, the senses of being in close proximity to trash, the smells, the sights, sometimes the tastes even of having these things in your community. They can kind of inspire you to want to learn more. And that was my personal journey towards learning more about this. But as I said, living downwind from a landfill, behind an incinerator, or in a heavily polluted community, it's going to impact your relationship to waste. There are some people who live in communities that maybe have better funding, and they may not see pollution on the streets. They may never smell trash. They may never see overflowing garbage cans. They may never see an incinerator. And so it's really important to think about this, especially when we're trying to build community in different sustainability, climate justice movements, because often we forget that, people have different relationships to these things that we're trying to either educate people about, learn more about ourselves, and just in building communities together. And so when you are meeting people, always keep in mind, we all are going to have a different relationship to waste. And there are so many reasons why that is, but it's important to always keep it in mind. Next slide, please. Now, going back to this idea of waste as an inefficient use of materials, I do want to point out that by thinking in that way, we can make more action-oriented choices regarding what we consume and what we produce. Now, it's tricky having conversations about this sometimes, because the elephant in the room is always that the systems and structures are in place. And it's really difficult to change your behavior when, say, you live in a place where you don't have access to certain types of waste infrastructure, or you don't have equitable access to it. And so it's really difficult to try to change our behavior and make different choices when you don't even really have a choice. And this is the case for the majority of people who live in chronically disenfranchised communities. And I specifically use the language of chronically disenfranchised instead of poor or low income, because it really draws attention to the fact that this is a systemic structural issue. People don't just happen to live in these communities. People don't just happen to shortly, but we always have to keep that in mind as well. Going back to this point on community, sometimes there are people that we're going to be building community with. And I hear this often where somebody will say something like, I wish the people that I live near, I wish they cared more about this issue. Or, I wish they were more passionate about this issue. Don't they realize that we're dealing with climate catastrophe? I wish they cared more. They do care. They just have different access to resources than you do. And by resources, I mean the waste infrastructure, the educational materials, etc. And so it's just really important to keep that in mind as we move forward, have more conversations about this, and then just even think about these ideas and concepts generally. Next slide, please. So now I'm just going to talk a bit more about waste mismanagement, which leads to waste inequity. And we're going to discuss a bit, like how waste mismanagement disproportionately impacts communities of color. But I do want to specify again, like I did in the beginning, that it's mostly Black communities and Native communities that are disproportionately impacted by these. And that also gets a little bit messy demographically because it's Native communities, it's Afro-Indigenous communities, Afro-Latinx communities. And so it does get a little bit, tricky with language, but just wanted to point that out as well. Next slide, please. So waste inequity, my personal definition that I use in my own research is the ways in which the compounded effects of public policy, city planning, and structural violence result in harms and hazards that disproportionately impact chronically disenfranchised communities, specifically with respect to waste. Now, just to give a couple of examples here, there are 4.4 million people that live within a 3-mile radius of all 73 incinerators in the US. And most of the people impacted by this pollution are people of color. 79% of municipal solid waste incinerators are located in quote unquote environmental justice communities, which are also primarily communities of color. And then here we have Black Americans are 3 times more likely to die from exposure to air pollutants than their white American counterparts. But I do want to note again, we'll get into this more into the second installation of this, but this is not just a United States issue or US settler state issue. This is a global issue. And so I'm really just bringing these particular points here just to make this point here. But I do need to note that it's not just in the United States where we see these statistics. It doesn't matter what country you look at this data in, it's going to be the same. The people that are going to be most impacted are going to be communities of color, regardless of where you go. And if you live in a place where there's more of a homogeneous population, it's going to be the chronically disenfranchised communities where people are living below the poverty line. And so it's important to keep that in mind as well. And if we zoom out a bit, we're talking the people that are going to be most impacted are people that are living in the global south, who are also most extracted from, then those materials are used in the global north, and then all of that waste is brought back to the global south. And so that's another example of waste inequity, but more specifically, that's an example of waste colonialism, which I will get more into in Seed Series Part 2, which is the next one. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to point you to on the right-hand side here, I think that's your right. So this is a century of American garbage. This is just the development of landfills in the country. If you see a green dot, it means it's a closed landfill. If it's a red dot, it means it's a currently functioning landfill. But I must add that even if it is green and says that it is closed, this still has the potential to pollute groundwater, to impact soil, to degrade different bioregions and the ecosystems that call it home, and it can still lead to air pollution in these areas. So very important to keep in mind. Then, of course, waste facilities are most often sited in chronically disenfranchised communities. And we have to keep in mind that this is the result of planning, design, and the deliberate choices of people in positions of power. Landfills don't just happen upon places. There are months, years, sometimes decades of planning that go into where a landfill is going to go. And very sadly, sometimes there are different government agencies who will even waive their own rules just to ensure that a landfill can go into a certain place, even if they know the harms and hazards that are going to impact those communities. If you want to read more about that, I highly recommend the book Toxic Communities. It goes very into detail about how that happens and how things like racism, classism, and elitism generally are leading to those things happening to certain communities. And then, of course, as I have listed here, the constant exposure to air pollutants emitted by waste facilities can increase your risk of numerous types of illnesses, mostly respiratory illnesses. It's also important to note that it's not just people who live in these communities, it's people who work around waste infrastructure. Your sanitation workers who are working at landfills, who are working in incinerators, who are working in waste transfer stations, and even who are driving the vehicles that are transporting this waste from place to place. And I also want to add here, just as a data point that not a lot of people realize, if you live in a bigger city, there's a big percentage, that a large percentage of that city's trash is ending up in communities that are miles away. For instance, about 700,000 tons of trash from New York City ends up in this very small town in Virginia called Waverly. It's a 69% Black community, and that is where a ton of our trash goes, to one of the largest landfills in the country. And just for a bit of history, back when this landfill was being developed, the people that lived in Waverly actually protested heavily the development of this landfill because they knew what was going to happen when it came to their community. Sadly, that didn't work. And the landfill is there. Now it's one of the biggest landfills in the country. And that is where we're sending so much trash, outsourcing, which is also a thing that costs money, which we will talk about on a different seed, more about community care and sanitation workers, where I'll get more into that and how that is costing taxpayers money as well, the exportation of trash to other places. But just to give a bit of an overview of all of this, I wanted to start there. Now to zoom out a bit, next slide, please. So now these are just some examples of some things that are going on in other places. Again, I will dive much more deeply into this in the waste colonialism seed, which is the next one. But on the left-hand side, we just have a map here of, export of e-waste in tons. We see the flow of it. We see where it's being generated, how much of it is being generated, and what I mentioned earlier about how a lot of it is being made in the global south. It's being purchased by people in the global north and then returning right back to the global south to disproportionately impact the people that live there, primarily communities of color, who are dealing with countless health effects from this flow of e-waste. And on the right-hand side, we have one of literally thousands of examples of communities. This is Nova Scotia over here, and it's just showing where the waste infrastructure spaces are. This is from the Enrich project. I highly recommend that you check out what they're doing there. But if you see where the waste infrastructure is centered here, those are chronically disenfranchised communities. And as I said, whether you go to Nova Scotia, the UK, anywhere on this planet, if you look where the waste infrastructure is, the vast majority of it is going to be in chronically disenfranchised communities. And I wanted to make sure I added that slide here just to really drive the point home that this is not just a local issue, this is a global concern. Next slide, please. Great, so now we're going to talk a bit about waste, this idea of waste again. And we're going to talk about alternatives to waste management or different types of waste management that don't center disposability. Now, first of all, we're going to talk, next slide, please. So just to kind of ground us here, we're going to talk about the difference between a linear, a circular, and a regenerative economy, just to kind of ground us. And before I answer this question of, what determines where waste materials actually end up. So when we talk about linear economies, we're talking about the process of collecting raw materials so that we can transform them into these goods, these products, distribute them. But ultimately, it's really, take, make, trash. Take it right to the trash can. That's the linear economy model. Now, when we move to the circular economy model, we're talking about three main principles. Eliminate waste and pollution, circulate those products and materials at their highest value, and then of course, it's driven by design. And so for that, it's take, make, reuse, reduce, recycle, and not so much take it right to the trash. See how much you can keep of it in circulation so you can really think about the full life cycle of these products, of these materials, etc. And then finally, we have the regenerative economy, which I'll go more into in the next slide. But for now, I do just want to talk about access and equity and how they're primary factors that impact where waste materials end up and the types of materials that enter our communities as well. Not everybody has proximity to zero waste stores, for instance. Different sanitation departments have different budgets depending on different things. Then of course we have things like the role of how waste is managed and generated. And this all goes back to policy and legislation, of course. And this varies so much because this is a municipality-based thing. Sometimes it can vary from block to block, street to street, zip code to zip code, city to city. Really depends on where you live. And so you can't really do a one-size-fits-all conversation about things like this because depending on the city or town you live in, the rules and regulations and the ways that waste is managed can look so drastically different depending on where you are. And so what we're capable of doing in terms of our actual behavior as consumers, producers, waste generators, etc., it really depends on these background features of where we live that are going to ultimately determine what we can do and yeah, what's possible for us. Next slide, please. So when we talk about working toward a regenerative economy and like leaving behind the linear and the circular economy, one way I like to think about the circular economy is this idea of sustainability, doing what we can to make sure that we can sustain ourselves, sustain the planet, sustain ecosystems, etc. The way I view a regenerative economy is leading more from abundance and not so much just sustainability. It's thinking beyond sustainability and moving more towards, not just this idea, but the reality that abundance can literally always blossom no matter where we are. And a lot of these ideas are, have been spoken about for thousands of years by native peoples and in traditional ecological knowledge, and also a lot of indigenous to Africa communities, et cetera, that have been thinking through these issues for literally thousands of years, and they think beyond sustainability and think more about abundance. And so the main principles here, the way I like to look at it, are engagement, a comprehensive view, and ecological health. So first of all, we center informed, equitable, and empowered participation and community-led responses to crises. Specifically, what I mean is, in a lot of communities that deal with things like waste inequity and waste colonialism, one way that some of the conditions that people are living through, one way to deal with that is to, join community boards, run for local office, and organize, all of these things. But not every community can do that. Not everybody has the physical capacity, the psychological capacity, the economic feasibility to be able to spend the time to do this. And so in a lot of the literature, they say, community cohesiveness and the ability to even build community to combat this violence is itself a privilege. It is a thing that requires power that some communities don't have. Now, this isn't always the case, but in a lot of cases, sometimes just being able to build coalitions to combat these things is something that isn't even accessible to some people due to equity issues. Now, for comprehensive view, what I mean by that is viewing all systems, structures, and institutions in a holistic way that centers the health of ecosystems and the communities that they interact with, affect, etc. So this means not just looking at hospitals on their own, looking at schools on their own, looking at communities, apartments, housing authorities on their own, looking at it all as a cohesive unit that is necessarily going to be impacted by the surrounding ecological environment, the bioregion, etc. You can't take one piece out because it's all necessarily connected. And so when we talk about a regenerative economy, it's taking all of that in mind, keeping all of that in mind as we come up with these ways to address the crises that we're dealing with. And I don't use solutions language because just because something is a quote unquote solution in one community, the violent systems are still intact and other communities are still being impacted, other people and living beings are being harmed. So really what you've come up with is a way to address a local issue. It's not actually a solution. So I personally avoid the solutions language, but having more of a comprehensive view also prevents us from using the solutions language because we always have in the back of our minds that there are more people than just our community and more beings than just people that are being impacted by these crises. And then finally, centering ecological health. It's honoring and respecting Earth's natural systems at all stages of production and development in all industries, not just clothing, but also food, all the industries. Next slide, please. All right, and this brings us down to some top-down issues here. Now, this, of course, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because, when we're individuals that don't have as much power as the people that are in positions of power in some of these corporations and organizations that are directly responsible for these harms that people are suffering, it gets tricky, but it is important to talk about these things, keep them in mind, and know that that is happening so we can always have that in our perspective. So things like bottom-up diversion, this is the issue that I'll talk about first. So what are some next steps here? Creating accessible textile recycling networks, for instance, because landfills receive about 11.3 million tons of textiles per year. That's one way. Of course, planned obsolescence. This results in millions of trashed electronics a year, and about 40 million metric tons of e-waste are disposed annually globally. 40% of all food produced in the United States is wasted. Meanwhile, 30% of US residents struggle with food insecurity. And then finally, 9% of all plastic waste ever produced has been recycled. And a circular plastics economy is one of the most reliable ways to move forward. So as I said, these are really points of departure that I'm planting the seed here so you can think more about this and see what's going on in your specific community in regards to these particular issues. Because as I mentioned earlier, all of these waste management things are handled so differently depending on the municipality that you live in. But they are all also directly related to these high level things, these top down changes that need to be made. Like non-renewable energy production must be brought to a halt and prevented from occurring in the future. We literally have to eliminate the conditions of possibility for these things to be done in the first place. And that really can't be done if from the top down, the changes aren't made to make that possible. Finally, banning the production of plastics that aren't necessary for medical or safety purposes. Finally, mandating textile circularity and banning mass production of exploitation-based cheap garments, which is also, of course, going to directly impact the quality of life that are working in the facilities that are creating these garments and such. So this is also very much a human rights issue as well. Again, comprehensive view. There are so many things going on when we're talking about the world of waste. And then finally, ensure that all food that is produced is accessible to address food apartheid concerns and decrease emissions. And I use the language of food apartheid instead of food deserts, because this idea of deserts, it makes it seem as if this is a natural occurrence. Just there are some areas that happen to not have healthy food. No, this is also a structural systemic issue where there are certain communities, chronically disenfranchised communities, that are necessarily being impacted by not having access to food because of these things. And so again, this just goes back to thinking about how all of these things are working together to make this happen, and that it's not just on the individual here. This is a feedback loop that I mentioned earlier, and there are so many things at play here. So we really have to have a comprehensive view so that we can best address these different ideas, these different issues locally. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, like anti-racist work, this is an ideal, this is a goal, since we are up against actual systems, these global intersecting systems of violence and cultures of domination that are deeply embedded in our daily lives. We have to start somewhere. We can't all be perfect at this because a lot of us literally don't have the access to the things to make it possible to be able to be perfect when it comes to addressing some of these issues, but there are so many ways to begin. I like to think of it as choosing a lane, sticking with that lane, and doing what you can in that lane. So since access and equity are the key factors here, we have to be patient, we have to honor our own individual journeys, and we have to collaborate whenever we can. We have to build community, share resources, and we have to be open to learning as much as we possibly can so that we can reduce waste, and change our relationship to consumption and disposability more generally. So some of these organizations that I've listed down here are organizations that are doing this work. So we have Fab Scrap. This is an incredible textiles recycling organization. We have Precious Plastics, which is this global community of people who are building machines that can shred and melt down plastics and turn them into things that can have use. Then of course, this next one, it's called Rebundle. I highly recommend anybody who likes getting their hair braided. It's a completely compostable hair extension brand, which I also recommend. Then we have things here like Imperfect Foods, Misfits Markets. These are just a couple of examples of companies, organizations that are addressing these concerns that have to do with the overproduction of waste and the overaccumulation of waste in different areas. So in your community, there may be so many other ones that address specific needs to where you live, your specific bioregion, or maybe in your community, there are certain types of waste that are produced more than others. And so I highly recommend that you look to see what's going on in your specific community. Because another thing I like to add is often we hear things like, why is nobody talking about this? Why is nobody doing anything about this? Chances are somebody is. And chances are there's a community rallying behind this who's been rallying behind the particular issue you're thinking of for at least decades. Sometimes they just don't have the resources to be able to get the word out, to get people to see what's going on and to have their voices heard. And so it's important to really do some digging and see what you can do in your community, how you can help them out, and see how you can participate in the change locally in your own community, because you can work globally while thinking globally. Next slide, please. On the last slide, I mentioned changing our relationship to consumption and disposability. And this is a mindset and a positionality issue. It's a mindset thing because sometimes we think just because something is broken or frayed or in a state of disrepair that it's trash, My iPhone doesn't work anymore, time to get the next one. This goes back to planned obsolescence again. Or my jeans got a rip, time to toss them in the trash, which is a whole other issue as well, because there are so many different ways to dispose of these different things. I'm going to talk a bit more about properly disposing of materials in the sanitation workers installment of the Seed series, because that's another thing that's really important to think about, because there are countless sanitation workers who are actually like injured or sometimes deal with fatalities because of people improperly disposing of their trash. But again, this is a mindset thing. Just because something no longer serves a purpose to you, chances are it absolutely would serve a purpose to somebody else in some type of way. And until you've exhausted all possible options for a particular material or object, it is not trash. And so you have to allow yourself to get creative with the things that you consume and keep the full life cycle of each item and material in mind. Just as a quick example, one of my favorite things to talk about this about is food and food waste. There are so many, you should be composting your food waste, and two, you shouldn't be wasting food at all, but there are uses for these things. You can use food scraps, for instance, to dye clothes. You could turn them into watercolors. There are so many different things you could do with so many different materials, and it really just comes down to getting creative. And luckily, there are so many cool organizations and artists and creators and musicians who are using so many different materials that other people have deemed trash or waste, and they're using it and doing incredible things with it. So it really is an opportunity for you to think about, what can I do with this material? How can I prevent this thing from going to a landfill, from going to an incinerator? Always something to keep in mind. Now, one thing you hear a lot in like sustainability circles is, buy higher quality stuff. Get the zero waste goods, get the stuff that's gonna last longer so you don't have to keep getting disposable things. But then this comes back to the equity and access issue. Investing in high quality goods that are less likely to break, it's an access issue. Not everybody can afford these things. And zero waste goods, you don't have to buy new expensive items marked as zero waste to reach your goals. In many communities even, having the bag full of plastic bags under the sink, reusing your pasta jars and your different glass jars to do other things with them, turning different t-shirts that are old into rags that you can now use to clean, keeping all of your plastic bottles and DIYing your own cleaning materials. Like the list goes on, and it's just all about getting creative and doing what you can to prevent it from going to landfill. Again, I will reiterate, there are top-down changes that are necessary, but one thing that I always like to harp on is that when/if some generation gets to a place where we are actually living in a zero waste, abundant world, we need to have those patterns and habits in place of changing our mindsets and changing how we think about our relationship to consumption and disposability, so that when this new world that we're trying to build actually exists, we know how to treat it. And that starts with changing our mindset and changing our behavior now in ways that we can, and with respect to our access and equity needs and possibilities. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a bit about kinship with waste and what it means to coexist with waste in ways that aren't damaging to ourselves or the planet. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that waste materials are embedded in all natural cycles. Now in the little blue circles here, you'll see the hydrologic cycle and the soil food web, and I'll start with that. So when we talk about the hydrologic cycle, we're talking about the ongoing travel and exchange of water molecules between the planet's water bodies, the land, and the atmosphere. We're talking precipitation, evaporation, groundwater, rain, etc. And then when we're talking about the soil food web, we're talking about the biodiverse communities of microorganisms, macroorganisms that are living in the soils, whose parent materials are sourced from the remains of plants and animals embedded in geologic matter. What that means is basically big rocks throughout history have been eroding over time and creating our soil. Now, the main point here is that all waste materials are embedded in these cycles, so we're necessarily coexisting with these materials. Next slide, please. And that's important to note because, as it says here, we really do need to develop protocols and ethics around how to deal with pollution that is also land, that is also kin, and that is also supporting ecosystems. Please go to the next slide. This is just illustrating again, this idea that we're coexisting with waste. All of these things are necessarily embedded in waste cycles here. If you want to zoom in, look at this picture. That's just giving you another little illustration there, but we can go ahead to the next slide. So this is really just to leave with some parting ideas for you to walk away with here, to leave this presentation with anyways, about learning, collaborating, and advocating. If you have access to stable internet, find local programs and initiatives aimed at reducing waste and stimulating a circular economy, but ultimately working towards a regenerative economy. Finally, connect with your neighbors and build community around addressing issues related to waste management to the best of your ability. And then finally, get involved with or start campaigns aimed at ensuring that your local municipality centers waste diversion that is equitable and accessible. And then we have these questions here. How can I extend the life of this material or item? How else can I put this material or item to use? Can I or someone else return this material or item to its original condition? And does this material or item have a longer life cycle than I've acknowledged? Probably so. Next slide, please. And yeah, so there you have it. I'm really excited to answer any questions that you have. If there's anything you want me to clarify at all, feel free to go ahead and yeah, you can pop it in the chat, or if there's a moment of silence, you want to just unmute and ask, that's totally fine. But again, I'm so thankful that you all joined me here today.
Thank you so much, Jesi. That was fantastic. And we really appreciate you taking the time to do this presentation. So we don't have any questions quite yet, but as Jesi mentioned, please feel free to put questions in the chat or go off mute, and we can do it that way as well. Let's see, Christy.
Hi.
I see your hand up. You can go off mute.
Hi, I actually did put a question in the chat for Jesi. I guess you didn't see it. So thank you for the presentation. I follow you on Twitter and I absolutely love what you're about. My question is centered around carbon dioxide as waste. I don't know if you touched on climate change any at all, but you know, a piece of research I'm doing right now, there's like conversation about the disproportionate generation of carbon dioxide for luxury versus survival. And I wonder if there is any scope in this conversation, or maybe it will come up in a future date, in terms of how we frame that, because when we think about the need or the push to reduce carbon dioxide, we're talking about renewables, which in and of itself has its own problems with inequity and injustice. So if you can think about the conversation series that you're hosting, and whether or not there is space to actually discuss how we go about implementing all of these solutions. The last point you made about coexisting with waste, one of the central theses about waste is that there's no process on earth that does not generate waste. So even if we move towards renewables, we still have to contend with some amount of waste. So how do we balance that with the needs of the poorer classes to survive versus the needs of the more affluent classes to enjoy luxury? And that whole conversation is a ethical cluster French word right there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, thank you so much for that comment. That's so important to bring up. I will touch on that a bit in the waste colonialism portion of the seed series, but also towards the end. I'm going to bring it up a bit when I talk about waste and pop culture, because interestingly, you do see a lot of conversations like this happening in movies and television and in some books as well, because what you were mentioning about, the CO2 generated for luxury versus survival goods, this ultimately goes back to the mindset positionality thing I was talking about, where we have to change how we're even viewing the things that we are producing, just generally. What is the purpose behind them? Why are we making it? Who is making it and for what purpose? Who is profiting from it? So there's not only is there space for that in there, but it's definitely something that should be centered. And in most of the future ones I talk about it a bit, but specifically in relation to the topic of it. So thank you for bringing up that comment because it's very important.
Thank you. So we have a question in the chat, which is, would you, and this is actually something I really loved hearing about as well. Will you chat a bit more about not using the solutions language and how you kind of came to that conclusion? I also found that really interesting.
Sure. So my issue with the solutions framing generally was mostly just from being in different sustainability conversations where people will be specifically focusing on local issues and framing those as solutions, as if this local way of addressing a local problem is necessarily a solution. It goes back ultimately to this mindset issue I have too, where we need to think about things more comprehensively and not just in terms of what's like right here, what's just in my community. And when we take away this solutions language and focus more on, one, what is it that we're even addressing and why? How is it that this thing that I'm addressing in this way is going to impact not just this community, but other communities as well? And how can we kind of move away from thinking as if, oh, this is the be all end all to necessarily fix this particular thing? We have to move away from that because especially as pollution increases, as emissions still continue to rise, we have to realize that it's going to have to be this constant feedback loop. Things are going to continue changing, things are going to continue evolving. And so we have to be flexible when we're even talking about addressing these issues, because there's not just going to be this one surefire way to address or fix or repair some of these issues. And so that's why I personally stray away from that language. And it also gives us an opportunity to create better language for talking about some of the issues that we're facing.
Great, thank you for that. Another question from the chat. Curious to understand what conversations are happening around a just transition for workers impacted by the transition back towards a circular economy, and who is doing serious work around this. And I know some of this might be covered in a future webinar, but would love to hear your quick version here.
So yeah, I mean, my main thing to say is just like, it's so tricky because this is going to be so dependent on where somebody is located specifically. There are so many different laws and policies regarding this that depending on where you are, it's going to look so different. And so I hesitate to kind of give a succinct answer because there's no possible way to make a succinct answer, but there are so many different people in different communities doing work towards this. And I would definitely look more towards people that are on the ground, the organizers that are spearheading some of these movements. I would definitely look to the organizers on the ground to answer the question in your specific area.
Great, thank you. It looks like Howard Tinky, sorry if I got your last name wrong, has his hand up, so you can go off mute, Howard. You're not actually off mute. Try again. There you go. Right. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm in Australia. It's about 10 to 5. I'm not too bright at the moment. I always wonder what impact this absolutely necessary approach to waste impacts on the whole community. On the whole economy, and the way the economy runs at the moment, which is driven by the need to create jobs and by consuming mindlessly. So like if we're using products much more efficiently, how does that impact on the economy, which is based on needing to produce stuff all the time, endlessly, mindlessly? Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I do want to add, there was a great report from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance who said that there are more jobs in the green sector anyways, like in recycling and such. So I highly recommend everybody look to that report just because there's so many jobs in this. But it's tricky because so much of it is a mindset thing. When we're so conditioned and have been conditioned for generations, no matter where we live, to just mindlessly consume, it's tricky. And since so much of the unlearning and deprogramming of that is going to depend on more messaging that is equitable and accessible, it gets tricky. And so one main thing I will say, because that's a really difficult question to answer, is it ultimately comes down to doing all that we can to ensure that the deprogramming messaging is accessible. It's in multiple languages. Luckily, there's a lot of educators that are, using social media to do what they can to get these messages out there. They're going from place to place in their actual communities, putting up flyers, trying to teach people things. But it's really tricky because, as I said, this feedback loop, when the violent systems and structures are still intact and are necessarily doing what they can to ensure that they can be perpetuated, it gets really tricky. So it comes down to these individual, interpersonal level moments of opposition that we use together to combat these things. And it's really like a moment to moment, one day at a time thing, but keeping in mind that there are always organizers, educators, facilitators, dreamers, thinkers, etc., who are doing this work on the ground right now. And so we've already come such a long way over the last couple of decades, and it's really just going to be it's going to be a process. It's really just going to be a process, but a lot of it comes down to community, meeting your neighbors, the people that live near you, and doing what you can to get these messages across, and meeting each other with compassion and empathy, and keeping those access and equity issues in mind as we're trying to educate each other and learn ourselves.
Well, thank you, Jesi. I think that was a great way to close, and a good introduction to the next session in the series, which will be on July 27th, same time. And it will be about waste, colonialism, and inequity. Thank you again. This is excellent to have you speaking to us about these issues. It's so important. Also, a quick shout out to Common Grounds Compost, who kind of started this series, and then we were able to kind of take over it. So thank you to Common Grounds. And this is, as many of you know, throughout the entire pandemic, especially, there are some there are always challenges that arise with these kinds of webinars. So we will keep working on the technology tweaks that need to happen for this, including making sure we are correctly recording and getting some closed captions for the next session. And we will be sending out a follow-up email to this webinar. And as always, please feel free to visit the blog post on our website, which I will put on the chat, which has all of the login information for the next several webinars. And thank you again 1,000 times to Jesi. Can't wait for the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.